1961, I was a young fighter pilot in Germany when the first cosmonauts and astronauts were launched into space, and then I began to dream about maybe that would be the ultimate experience for a pilot.
12 men have walked on the moon. 12 human beings have stood on that barren gray surface, looked back at Earth hanging in the black sky, and felt something the rest of us can only imagine. They returned as heroes, giving interviews, writing books, speaking in schools and museums. They talked about the science, the mission objectives, the engineering milestones, but there always seemed to be something they didn't talk about, something in their eyes when questions got too personal, something in the way they paused when asked what it was really like. For decades, the official story was enough. The moon was exactly what we expected, a dead, cratered rock, scientifically valuable but ultimately empty. The astronauts saw what the cameras showed, and nothing more. Charles Duke was the 10th man to walk on the moon. As the lunar module pilot for Apollo 16 in April 1972, he spent more than 20 hours on the surface, driving the rover through the Descartes Highlands, collecting samples, running experiments. He was 36 years old, a test pilot, a family man, a by-the-book astronaut known for following procedures and executing missions flawlessly. NASA's reports say Duke and Mission Commander John Young completed every objective. The scientific community praised the geological samples. Apollo 16 was considered one of the Apollo program's most successful missions. And yet, something happened to Charles Duke on the moon, something it took him 40 years to speak about openly, something NASA never included in any official report, something that, even now, at 89 years old, he struggles to describe. In recent interviews, Duke has begun to share what he says he truly experienced during those 71 hours on the lunar surface. And what he describes does not match the official narrative. It doesn't match what he told reporters in 1972. It doesn't match what appears in textbooks. According to Charles Duke, the moon is not what we've been told, and what he encountered there changed everything he believed about our place in the universe. This is his story. The story he says he couldn't tell until now. Charles Duke, the astronaut NASA trusted. Charles Duke grew up in South Carolina, the son of a naval officer. From childhood, he was drawn to flight, earning a pilot's license while still in high school. He attended the Naval Academy, became an Air Force pilot, then a test pilot, following the traditional path into the astronaut corps. In 1966, Duke was selected by NASA as part of its 5th astronaut group. He was known as calm under pressure, technically sharp, and dependable. These were not thrill-seekers looking for adventure. They were engineers and test pilots, people trained to understand complex systems and follow protocols precisely. Duke's first major role came as Capcom, the capsule communicator, for Apollo 11. He was the voice from Houston that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin heard during the first moon landing. Over the radio, he said, "Roger, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot."
Roger, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
That was Duke, steady, professional, locked into the mission. 3 years later, he got his own chance. Apollo 16 launched on April 16, 1972. Duke flew with Commander John Young and Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly. The mission lasted 11 days. Duke and Young spent 71 hours on the moon, longer than any previous mission. Officially, the objectives were scientific: explore the Descartes Highlands, collect samples from terrain geologists suspected might be volcanic, test new equipment, and conduct experiments. Every minute was planned. Every movement had a purpose. Everything was built to expand human understanding of the moon. And, by the numbers, Apollo 16 delivered perfectly. But if you watch the Apollo 16 footage closely, there are moments that feel off. There are points where Duke stops, completely still, staring at something outside the camera's frame. John Young's voice comes over the radio. "Charlie, you okay?" Duke answers, but after a delay, a hesitation. "Yeah, I'm fine, just looking." Looking at what? The official transcripts don't say, the mission reports don't mention it, and for 40 years, neither did Duke. The silence after Apollo 16. When Apollo 16 splashed down on April 27, 1972, Duke and his crewmates were celebrated worldwide. Ticker tape parades, a White House visit, a global tour. Duke gave hundreds of interviews. He spoke about the mission's technical achievements, the geology, the experiments, the strange sensation of reduced gravity, and the beauty of Earth seen from space. But he never spoke about what he says he saw, about the things that didn't belong in the mission plan. The experiences that didn't fit the scientific framework NASA presented to the world. Years passed. Duke left NASA in 1975. He became a businessman and a speaker. He was also a devout Christian, openly discussing how seeing Earth from space affected his faith. He spoke candidly about his life, his struggles, and his beliefs. And yet, on this subject, he stayed quiet. He gave safe interviews about safe topics. He let people accept the official story until recently. The shift, what Duke began saying. After 2015, around 2015, when Duke was already in his 80s, something changed. He began giving interviews that went beyond the standard Apollo narrative. His language shifted. He started describing details he had avoided for decades. He said the light was wrong, not merely different, wrong. Sunlight on the moon should appear pure white, maybe slightly yellow. There is no atmosphere to scatter it. That's basic physics. But Duke said that sometimes, when he looked in certain directions, he saw colors that shouldn't exist, blues and purples. Not reflections, he insisted. The light itself appeared colored, and it shifted. He would look away, then look back, and it would be different. He talked about sound. There should be no sound on the moon. No air, no transmission. They knew that, but Duke said he heard things anyway. Not over the radio, not mechanical noises from the suit. He described tones, frequencies, sometimes harmonic, sometimes discordant. He said he asked John Young if he heard it. Young did. They both did, and they didn't report it because it was impossible. Duke also described a feeling of being watched. He claimed that if astronauts were honest, they would admit something similar. A sense of observation, not from Houston, but something else. A kind of attention, a presence, not threatening but immense, like standing before something vast that is aware of you. He described moments where time felt strange. The schedule was strict, every minute accounted for, but Duke said there were stretches where he would be working, completely focused, and then realize, by his suit timer, that 20 minutes had passed, while it felt like 2. Other times, a task that should take 5 minutes felt like an hour. John Young experienced it as well. They compared notes. Their subjective sense of time didn't match the clock, and Duke was not vague about any of this. He was specific, detailed, and consistent across multiple interviews. He also said he wasn't alone. In 2017, Duke attended a private reunion of Apollo astronauts, one of the rare occasions when many surviving moonwalkers were together. Duke later said they finally discussed privately what they had never discussed publicly, what they actually experienced. According to Duke, every astronaut had anomalies, different for different missions, but none of their experiences aligned perfectly with what NASA told the public. He said there was no direct threat from NASA. Instead, the silence came from something else. They believed no one would accept it. Worse, people would assume they were unstable, so they stayed quiet. All of them. But Duke, now in his late 80s, decided he was done. The 2019 interview. Yes, absolutely yes. The most significant revelation, Duke says, came in a 2019 interview when he was 84. The interviewer asked directly, "Did you see anything on the moon that NASA has not acknowledged?" Duke replied, "Yes, absolutely yes." When asked what he saw, Duke paused for a long time, then answered, "Structures. Not natural formations, not rocks that simply appeared geometric. Structures, artificial, old, very old." He said they were in the highlands, on the far side of a ridge, out of direct view from Earth. He said they had driven the rover roughly 6 kilometers from the lunar module. They were supposed to be collecting samples from a specific crater when Duke noticed something on the horizon, geometric, too regular to be natural. He called it out to John Young. Young saw it too. Duke said they drove closer. It wasn't part of the planned route, but they had discretion. As they approached, he said it became clearer. Something like a wall or foundation, angular, block-like, covered in dust but unmistakably constructed. Duke described it as possibly around 100 meters long, extending into the lunar surface at both ends, as if they were seeing only part of something larger. The interviewer asked if they reported it. Duke said they tried. He said they called Houston and described what they were seeing. According to Duke, there was a long delay, and then they were instructed to continue with the planned sample collection. No acknowledgement, he said, no request for photos, nothing. Duke said they understood what that meant. Houston did not want them pursuing it. The interviewer asked if they took photos anyway. Duke said they did. Dozens. Close-ups, context shots, everything. He said all of it was on the film they brought back. And according to Duke, those photos were never released. Not to the public, not to the scientific community. He said he asked NASA about them repeatedly over the years and was always given one of several explanations. Technical reasons, loss, poor quality. But Duke insisted he took those photos, and they were clear. They showed exactly what he said they saw. Artificial structures on the moon. Then came what Duke described as the most troubling aspect. When asked whether the structures looked recent, Duke said no, quite the opposite. They looked ancient, eroded even though there is no weather on the moon, covered in impact craters suggesting they had been there for a very long time, millions of years possibly. He said they predated anything humans have built. He said they predated humans. The interviewer asked the question that hangs over all of it: who built them? Duke said he didn't know. And that, he said, was what made it so difficult. He said he didn't know who or what built structures on the moon long before humans arrived, but he believed NASA knew and had decided the public should not. Backlash, more details, more anomalies. After that interview, Duke encountered what he said he had feared for decades: mockery and dismissal. Mainstream media largely ignored his claims. Skeptics suggested he was misremembering, seeking attention, or affected by age-related confusion. Duke did not withdraw his statements. He offered more detail. He described other anomalies, regions where the lunar dust looked disturbed. Too recently, he suggested, to match natural processes. Trails or paths implying movement across the surface, glints of metal or glass in crater walls that he said didn't match known lunar geology. He described areas that felt different, where crossing an invisible boundary changed the sense of presence, intensifying or vanishing entirely. He compared it to moving through rooms in a house, each room with a different feeling, even though it is part of the same structure. He also spoke about radio interference that didn't fit known explanations, brief transmissions on frequencies that should have been quiet, bursts of sound, neither voices nor mechanical noise, almost musical. NASA, he said, suggested it could be reflections from Earth broadcasts, but Duke pointed out they were on the far side of the moon, where Earth transmissions should not reach. He also described moments he called clarity. A few times, usually when he was alone and away from John Young, he said he would suddenly understand things, not as words, but as a kind of knowledge about the moon, its history, and why they were there. Then it would fade, and he couldn't hold on to it. But during those moments, he said, he knew, absolutely knew, they were being allowed to be there, that they were guests, that the moon was not empty and never had been. These statements sounded extraordinary, like science fiction, but Duke was not a fringe personality. He had impeccable credentials: an Air Force brigadier general, a test pilot with thousands of flight hours, an astronaut who executed one of history's most complex missions without error, widely regarded as rational, skeptical, and honest. So the question sharpened: was Charles Duke losing his mind? Or was he finally saying something he had kept hidden for 40 years? The pattern. Other astronauts, similar admissions. The question became more complicated as other astronauts made statements that echoed the same theme. Buzz Aldrin, in a 2018 interview, mentioned monoliths on Mars' moon Phobos and suggested people should want to know what put them there. Edgar Mitchell spoke for years about government knowledge of extraterrestrial intelligence. Al Worden, Apollo 15's command module pilot, stated publicly that he believed humans were descendants of ancient aliens. These were not outsiders. They were men who went to space, who were trusted with missions worth billions, and who performed flawlessly. And in their later years, no longer employed by NASA, no longer protecting careers or reputations, they were, in Duke's view, all pointing to the same conclusion. The official story is incomplete. What they experienced did not match what they were permitted to say publicly. Duke's most recent interviews became even more explicit. In a 2023 podcast appearance, he was asked whether he believed there was a cover-up. Duke said he didn't see it as a conspiracy. He called it institutional paralysis. He said NASA didn't know what to do with information that didn't fit the accepted scientific paradigm. He believed they had data, photos, measurements, observations from multiple missions, suggesting the moon was stranger than the dead rock narrative, but that releasing it would force a confrontation with what people believe about humanity's place in the universe. So, he claimed, they sat on it. Not out of malice, he said, out of fear, institutional cowardice. When asked what he thought the structures were, Duke answered that he believed the moon had been inhabited. Not now, at least not obviously, but at some point in the past, something built on the moon. He even floated a possibility that he acknowledged sounded extreme. Maybe they built the moon. He said that once you have stood there and seen what he claims they saw, the question is not whether it's possible, but how to integrate that reality with what we thought we knew. When asked why he was speaking now, Duke said he was 89 years old. He had lived a good life and had a good career. He didn't need NASA's approval. He didn't care if people thought he was crazy. He said what he cared about was the truth, and he repeated a point he returned to often. 12 men walked on the moon, and all of them experienced things that suggest our understanding of the moon, of space exploration, and of our cosmic context is incomplete. He said humanity deserves to know, especially if it's uncomfortable. The evidence problem: photos, gaps, and corroboration. So what is the truth? Is Charles Duke describing real experiences, or have time and age reshaped his memories of a mission from more than 50 years ago? The evidence, Duke argues, is complicated. NASA has never released all Apollo 16 photographs. Thousands of images remain unreleased, officially due to technical quality issues. But Duke and other astronauts have repeatedly claimed that some of the best photos, the ones showing anomalies, are among those that were never made public. Radio transcripts from Apollo missions also contain gaps. The official record labels these as transmission interruptions or technical difficulties, but astronauts have claimed that during some of those periods they were having clear conversations that were not preserved in the public record. Duke also points to vague corroboration from former NASA employees, some of whom have suggested unusual Apollo findings were set aside for analysis and never publicly discussed. None, he notes, have given specifics, citing non-disclosure agreements and classification. Duke acknowledges what lunar rocks confirm. The moon is ancient, geologically dead, and never had an atmosphere. But he argues that this does not contradict what he says he witnessed. He says the structures were not made by moon natives. They were built by something that came from elsewhere. In his framing, the moon's geology tells us its natural history. What he says they saw would speak to its archaeological history. He claims those are not the same thing, and not necessarily contradictory. He also argues that the most telling element is consistency. His descriptions, he says, match anomalies reported by other astronauts from other missions: the sense of presence, strange light, time distortion, and structures. If he were inventing stories or chasing attention, he argues, the claims would likely be unique. Instead, he says, they align with hints and partial admissions that have circulated for decades. So the central question becomes less about whether Duke believes what he's saying, and more about whether his memories accurately reflect what occurred, or whether the moon's extreme environment, the stress of the mission, cosmic radiation, and the sheer alienness of the experience could have produced misinterpretations or false memories. Duke addresses that directly. He says he has spent 40 years questioning his own recollection, but he also emphasizes he was not alone. John Young saw what he saw. They compared impressions in real time, and Duke believes their experience aligns with what other crews reported. At some point, Duke argues, multiple trained observers describing similar categories of anomalies should not be dismissed simply because the account doesn't fit expectations. Why it matters. Duke's final argument. Duke is 89 years old. He knows he doesn't have many years left, and he says he is now doing what would have been unthinkable earlier in his life, challenging the official Apollo narrative. He insists this is not meant to diminish Apollo's achievements. He remains proud of Apollo, proud of NASA, proud of what humanity accomplished. But he believes the story we tell about the moon is incomplete, and that the incompleteness has held us back. He argues that we could have continued lunar exploration, built bases, sent more missions, truly explored what is there. But we stopped after Apollo 17 in 1972, and we have barely returned since. The official explanation was budget constraints. Duke believes the real reason is different, that decision-makers realized the moon raised questions they could not answer, and it was easier to stop going than to face what was being found. Duke believes humanity is ready for the truth. He says people can handle it. We are not children. If there is evidence of ancient structures on the moon, of intelligence that predates us, of technologies we don't understand, he argues that isn't terrifying. It's inspiring. It's a challenge worth rising to. But he says we cannot rise to it while we are told it does not exist. His message, repeated across multiple recent interviews, is direct. He walked on the moon. He saw things not in any official report. And he says he is telling the public because he believes they deserve to know. The moon is not what you have been told. Space is not what you have been told. And if humanity wants to move forward, he argues, it has to begin with an honest accounting of what has been discovered. Whether history will vindicate Charles Duke or dismiss him as a confused elderly man remains uncertain. But his testimony raises questions that don't go away. If he is wrong, why do his descriptions align so closely with other astronauts' hints and admissions? If he is right, what does it mean that humanity has known about ancient lunar structures for more than 50 years and done nothing? The moon is still there. The structures Duke describes, if they exist, are still there. The evidence is still there. The question is whether we have the courage to look at it honestly and face what it might mean. Charles Duke walked on the moon 53 years ago. For 40 years, he stayed silent about what he says he truly saw. Now, at 89, he is saying something many people may not be ready to hear. But ready or not, he insists, the truth does not change. 12 men walked on the moon, and according to at least one of them, what they found there has been kept from the rest of us for half a century. The moon is not dead. The moon is not simple. The moon is not what we have been told. And Charles Duke, in the time he has left, is determined to make sure we know it, generation after generation,